And welcome everyone now to part 2 of the very much overly lengthy discussion of the Boston Massacre, the events leading up to and subsequent. I am joined today by Mr. Adventures in Historyland, not only an excellent online blog that I have actually referenced in the past for videos, but now actually a new and budding YouTube channel as well, with already all sorts of very long assortment of content for your perusal, but of course that does include part 1 of this video. Indeed, yes, there's a whole other hour of our prattling on this subject. So I would recommend go to his channel first. Again, Adventures in Historyland. The description will be found, the link will be found in the description down below. Watch part 1 there, because really it is, I think, necessary to understanding the context of everything that we're going to now be discussing in part 2. Not to worry, of course, we won't be going anywhere, so take your time with the other one, and then we'll be waiting for you back here. Thank you very much.
That Cornhill fray, I'm not quite sure what to do with it in terms of the overall thing, but it seems that something happened definitely regarding a group of soldiers out to cause trouble, whether it was warranted in their personal minds or not, that led a reaction to being a lot of angry people in the streets that night.
Yeah.
And it seemed all to fall towards the Sentinel in King Street.
Yeah, outside the Custom House, I think it was.
And as far as I can see, I mean, a great deal of what follows in the middle part of Preston's account is largely sustained by one side or the other, especially in the more positively, you might sort of say more on the army side, is one called the fair account of the unpleasant events in Boston or something like that. So we can quite easily kind of start getting into the actual event now. Having kind of seen, I think, given an idea of what the streets of Boston are like at the second on any given day, that you might find a party of citizens out wanting to fight soldiers, or on the other hand, you might find a bunch of soldiers trying to fight citizens. And
sorry, as well, actually, if I can just touch on something that you mentioned earlier, talking about how so many of these accounts contradict one another, and how difficult it is to determine what really happened with a lot of these things. And in so many ways, while obviously it is very significant, and it is absolutely worthwhile to really get into the nitty-gritty of, well, let's see if we can figure out what really happened that day at Cornhill. In a way, from the perception side of things, does it even particularly matter? Because what we're dealing with is such a, shall we say, polarized situation in which, an event happens and the reality is immediately diffused by both sides and changed to fit particular narratives. And as far as, of course, the men who are, standing, out on that snowy night on the 5th of March are concerned, they have an absolute reality of what happened earlier that day. It was a band of bloodthirsty soldiers going around and beating people in the streets, so you can't trust them. And obviously, when they start shooting, well, obviously they were ordered to do so, or if even not ordered, they don't care. Or, in the soldiers' part, obviously, they have been getting, abused and berated and beaten and attacked and provoked in the streets since their very arrival for, ultimately, no true reason. They're just trying to get by. And now, again, we have another instance with this massive, angry mob surging out on no provocation. The initial incident with, the Boston Massacre is, over a wig maker, a dispute over a financial transaction, over, really ultimately nothing. And now, all of a sudden, they attack us actively. They are beating us to the ground. We fire back. A couple of them end up dead. And now, all of a sudden, now we're the bad guys. It's like, the reality doesn't matter in a way. As far as the people who are on the ground are concerned, they have their realities, and they're sticking to those ones regardless of the truth of the matter.
Yeah. What is it they're saying? There's your opinion, there's my opinion, and there's what happened.
Yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, when it turns to violence, those sorts of things get, all the more telling, I suppose.
Yes, indeed. So one of the interesting things to pick out, I think, on looking at what I've got written down here, the bells start practically everything. everybody hears the bells thereafter, and that gets people onto the street. There is now. Before we started, you mentioned the thing I wrote down about that curious deposition that talks about an indentured servant who's instructed to fire shots out of an upstairs window. Now that's deposition 59 on page 46, I think. No, it's 58, but obviously 59 must be important as well. 58 on page 44 and 45.
50. All right, here we are. Charlotte Brigade?
Yeah, although confusingly, she is referred to throughout as a boy. So she, an indentured servant, and there's all sorts of people who gather eventually into the square. There's accounts not only from what you might call partisan sides, but for instance, black servants who might, for instance, have less to gain from one side or another.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, maybe more to lose at the same time in being deposed. But it's interesting, and I'll read it out, and we'll see if anything comes out of this, because it did when I read it a few days ago, and it goes that I, Charlotte Burgate, of lawful age, and indentured servant to Edward Mannering or Mainwaring, Esquire, being at my master's lodgings at Mr. Hudson's at the North End on the night of the horrid massacre in King Street on the 5th instant, heard the bells ring, which I took to be for fire. Half an hour before the bells rung, my master, with one Mr. Monroe, said they would go to the customs house and drink a glass of wine. Then I went out. There being nobody in the house that I knew of but Mr. Hudson and wife, then I went up to the custom house door and knocked, when a young man, which I have since heard was named Hammond Green, let me in and locked the door, when I saw my master and Mr. Monroe come downstairs and go into a room, when 4 or 5 men went upstairs, pulling and hauling me after them, and said, my good boy, curious, my good boy, come. When I was carried into the chamber, there was but one light in the room, and that in the corner of the chamber, when I saw a tall man loading a gun. Then I saw 2 guns in the room. My master not being in the chamber, there was a number of gentlemen in the room. After the gun was loaded, the tall man gave it to me, and told me to fire, and said he would kill me if I did not. I told him I would not. He, drawing a sword out of his cane, told me if I did not fire it, he would run it through my guts. The man putting the gun out of the window, it being a little open, I fired it, sideway up the street. The tall man then loaded the gun again. I heard the balls go down. The man then laid it on the window again and told me to fire it. I told him I would not fire again. He told me again he would run me through the guts if I did not, upon which I fired the same way up through the street. After I fired the second gun, I saw my master in the room. He took a gun and pointed it out of the window. I heard the gun go off. Then a tall man came and clapped me on the shoulders above and below stairs and said, that's my good boy. I'll give you some money tomorrow. I said, I don't want any money. There being a light in the lower room and the door being upon the jar, I saw it was the tall man that clapped me on the shoulder. Then the young man, Hammond Green, let me out of the door, there being 2 or 3 people in the entry. When I got out of the house, I saw a number of people in the streets, and I ran home as fast as I could and set up all night in my master's kitchen. And further say that my master licked me the next night for calling Mrs. Waldron about his firing out of the customs house. And for fear that I should be licked again, I did deny all that I said before Justice Quincy, which I am very sorry for, and further I say not.
Huh.
Now, what are you supposed to do with that?
That is, honestly, if you just showed me that account and you told me, all right, Brendan, guess what this is from, I would say, oh, okay, French Revolution, like early days French Revolution, um, like I alluded to earlier, Warsaw Uprising or something like that. But the actual day of the Boston Massacre, not only is this so, I suppose not entirely contrary to what we normally hear, because I've heard some accounts here and there of like people firing out of the customs house before. I believe in one of the sketches there is like a bit of a puff of smoke coming out of the customs house, with alluding to this idea that like there's an officer or a soldier or some official firing at the crowd or whatever. But here we have a number of fascinating occurrences, so to say. First off, the idea that clearly there are a number of men inside this building who are purposefully planning to turn this incident into something bigger. And this is like conspiracy theorists, frothing at the mouth, if you will, type thing, for lack of a better word. Because this is quite literally like, I don't know. This is using the public as the distraction to do something bad and then inspire the riot. A number of men doing this, and they pull this servant up to actually do the deed for them. Because the thing is that he or she, whichever one it is, they don't necessarily allude to until their master comes in and fires a shot themselves, which they get scolded for mentioning, in fact, beaten, licked for mentioning. The servant's the one who's made to pull the trigger, if it actually happened. Which is fascinating because they're not, clearly a number of these men in this room loading these guns, they could be firing this entire time. But instead, they pull out a sword and threaten the individual, no, you're going to pull the trigger. I'll aim it for you, but you're going to pull the trigger. Clearly speaking, and the thing is as well, that either this is a very intelligent indentured servant, or maybe there's some truth to the matter, like, okay, well, hey, if this goes south and I get arrested, I didn't shoot anyone. I mean, I may have been there, but the servant is the one who pulled the trigger. And of course, whoever this, gentleman likely is, they're going to have a lot more sway than a random indentured servant. They wouldn't have as much legal ground. Again, as it is said, they're already, they admit, in all fairness, at the very end, to already lying to a justice, just on threat of physical violence, which, again, not to say that isn't valid, but it does give us a sense that, like, okay, well, hold on, though. Like, you're admitting to lying earlier, but you're very sorry for it. Like, but are you lying now? Otherwise, you would get beaten. Like, this is not, because of this person's social, political, and economic status in society, it's not necessarily the most reliable source. But the way that they're phrasing it is still very intelligent. And, of course, they are admitting to their master shooting, which, if it was all a lie, I would be very perplexed as to what the social causes for throwing your own guy under the bus like that. Yeah. It's a very interesting account.
Sounds like justifiable deniability on the part of the people forcing her to do this.
Yeah.
But again, it's a little muddy. It's not the best source, as in terms of reliability, as to its use. Because it seems to address sort of the conspiratorial aspects of who was behind this act, and as you said before, there is the next deposition down confirms that, in quotes, this is from Gilliam Bass, 2 or 3 of the flashes were so high above the rest that the deponent verily believes they must have come from the custom house windows. That's 2 or 3 shots.
Which would speak to the earlier account that there are multiple firearms being handed to this person, and then the master comes out and takes his shot as well. Which is very interesting, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. But what purpose is not actually... I couldn't find anything that spoke to what purpose or who even side, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
They are. I mean, you assume that because they're not soldiers, that they might be on the side of people trying to instigate a fight with the soldiers. But on the other hand, of course, they could be Tories. They could be against the Sons of Liberty or something like that. It's interesting. The confusion that is going on in my head about this source almost makes it moot, because there's no easy way, except out of interest value, to to observe what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I what I would want to do if we were to do like more looking into and more work on this in particular, Hammond Green, who is that? Who is Mr. Hudson obviously, but the governor and such. But who are the men inside the room? Why are they there? Who is this person's master? Are they Tories who are maybe like trying to protect the soldiers? Like, no, how dare they? The soldiers can't fire, but we can. Or are they, sympathizers with the people who are on the ground, and they're thinking like, this is ridiculous. Someone has to act. Someone has to do something, and they pull a trigger, at one of the soldiers. She or he, the servant, doesn't mention who they're aiming at. They're just they aimed it out the window and told me to pull the trigger. Which again, either maybe it's because maybe because it's never even happened. Maybe it's because they don't know who they were aiming at, or maybe because they themselves are scared. They don't want to give away too much here. They don't want to be like, I fired upon a soldier of the crown, because all of a sudden, like, oof, that's really big. And even saying like, oh yes, I was the one who pulled the trigger, and that was the one that killed the rope maker or Crispus Attucks or whoever, because all of a sudden, again, small town, small city, you have those social connections. Like, it's such a quagmire of difficulty. It's repetitious, but you get the idea.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to see if we could find out more about who these people are, not just the servant in question.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it occurs to me that the way that it's phrased, that when she takes hold of the stock of the musket or gun, she's not quite specific as to whether it's a pistol or a musket.
That's true, or a fowling piece, or a military piece, or who knows, a fusee.
Deliberately trying to aim so she doesn't hit anything important.
Is that what she says?
I get the impression, yeah. She doesn't say she's trying not to, but she says she aims it down the street.
Oh, yes, you're right. I fired it sideways up the street. Correct.
So as if she's leaning out along the building almost.
Yeah. So yeah, if she's looking at the custom house, she would be firing, if down the street means down King Street, she's firing to the left, which is absolutely away from all the masses. Alternatively, if she's firing down, what was the other one, Queen Street or something? I forgot exactly what. There's another road, opposite, firing down that way. Well, that alone as well would have a big change, because that's probably going to be it's a bit more crowded there. There's probably going to be more people. There's a lot of, I feel like you can do a lot of the same, like CSI, type drawing the maps and drawing the lines and the little red tape and everything. There's a lot to be done with this instance here as well.
And even, another thought occurred to me, which we should address in the next sort of sequence of accounts, is that soldiers, and so Captain Preston in his account, he says he does not want to fire. Right now, I'm confused on that for a couple of reasons. Not because he doesn't want to fire. I completely believe he doesn't actually want to fire at people. But that he came down without anybody being loaded.
Yeah, which is contrary to most of the accounts, it seems, that they, normally I had read that when they arrived on the site, they did load with powder and ball, both. So they're capable of doing so. And of course, the fact that Preston does admit that they, clearly were loaded because, obviously the shots went off. There's no questioning that. Those men didn't, bring their own guns and shoot themselves. But yeah, but the fact that he does specify, but I didn't tell him to load and everything.
Yeah, but then who did, Preston?
Exactly. Who did tell them to load? When did they load? And
why? How did you miss them loading as well?
Exactly. It's a pretty big process. You're not gonna not recognize that. There's an awful lot of logistics to be had.
Yeah, but the thing is, there with if you join that with this servant's account, maybe the people in there, and this is just supposition, something in my head, are trying to get the soldiers to fire. So if they hear a shot, maybe they will respond with firing too.
Yeah. Interesting. So now she does fire. Now the servant as well, she specifically says, or she or he, I heard the balls go down. Now, yes, the tall man there loaded the gun again. I heard the balls go down. That tells me that, first off, they are loading, with ball. They are loading, and she explicitly mentioned that they had loaded the gun live. So, possibly maybe there is this idea going around that if there were people firing in the building with the intention of doing that, what I would do is if I'm trying to instill or spark violence of sorts, I would just load with powder and then just boom, fire, a double charge or whatever out the window. Technically, it wouldn't sound the same. Viewers of my channel will be aware of that. But that's gonna be enough. It's a boom. That's all you need in the heck and the chaos and the hectic nature. But she notes that they load with ball, but then aiming potentially away from individuals. Why load with ball at that point? But again, yeah, maybe potentially with this intention of not actually doing anything, but forcing the soldiers to do something. There are so many questions that are constantly cropping up, and this account really doesn't help things overall. You've made things much more complicated by bringing this one out. Why did you do this?
Because I saw it, and suddenly as I saw it, I dare you, Brandon, to have come across this and not show it to me.
Yeah. Goodness me, yeah. It's Upon which I fired the same way up the street. After I fired the gun, I saw my master in the room. He took a gun and pointed it out the window. I heard the gun go off. Very well-spoken servant as well. They are making sure to, basically make themselves innocent in all of this, it seems. And then again as well, who knows what would we be able to find, I doubt it, but any particular political opinions of this person? What are they thinking as they're doing all that? They're just stating what they had happen, that they were forced under threat of violence to do the act, and it's a mess. It's an absolute mess.
Maybe we should flee from this for now, because we don't have answers.
Yes, very true.
And return down to we know, and leave it that it would seem that it is corroborated that shots were fired from the customs house. For what reason, we do not know. Mm-hmm. It would seem likely that this person here is one of the ones who pulled the triggers up there. Mm-hmm. For what reason, we don't know, and maybe we'll look into it, and maybe someone in the comments knows more about who this person is. Yeah. But down on the ground in King Street, obviously, these shots happen roughly around the same time, whereas Preston says probably the second lot of muskets are unloaded down on the square or the street. Because he says one guy shoots first, and then there's just a ripple kind of down the line, and so everybody kind of said, "Oh, you're firing, okay."
Yeah, that automatic response of pulling the trigger when you hear a gun go off. Yeah.
So where should we go next? I have down. That was a very interesting account. I'm not sure if it really does anything for the rest of the video or anything, but
exactly.
But I think it would provoke discussion anyway.
Yes, no, and it's so vital explicitly because it throws a spanner into the rest of the works. It's you can put together oftentimes, and unfortunately a lot of popular media and whatnot, a lot of so-called documentaries and such will do exactly this. They will put together a very complete image based off of the evidence and the sources that they find, and they pin, here's what happened, here's the most authentic portrayal that we can put together. But then you have something like this happen, it's like, well, hold on now. This throws everything, into question. It changes the entirety of the narrative. Yeah, and it's frustrating because it means that you have to just move on because, well, what can we say about it? There's only so much we can say about it, and it has the potential to change everything dramatically based off of only a few small factors. Were these Tories or were they Whigs? That alone changes everything about it, but we don't have that information, at least not right now, which means that if we're making a movie, well, that's really frustrating. Yeah, and it speaks to the idea as well, of course, that the fact that we're able to have this conversation and ask these questions, that history is not just a stable or a singular quest, if you will. It's not like, okay, well, this is what it says on Wikipedia, that's what happened. Well, hold on, there's a lot more questions that can potentially be asked here. I'm sorry, I'm going off on a diatribe on things that you're well aware of.
This is good stuff. This is good stuff. It's true. In a theoretical scenario, if somebody out there has already, or if we were able to determine who these people in that building were, and what their motives were for ordering this servant to do this, that would put an entirely different light on the events of the Boston Massacre, and would force certainly a portion of people anyway, to interpret it slightly differently, and therefore change, just to show that history is a almost fluid thing in certain respects.
Like, obviously, there is an objective reality, but discerning that objectivity is always going to be subject to the resources that are available and the people who are utilizing those resources.
So, as a simple example right here, because we do not have any extra information about this event, this particular tiny event within this larger event, in going forwards, we will undoubtedly either simply say that it is, we would be able to resolve it, basically, given further information.
Yeah.
Therefore, giving a little, just sort of illustrating your point there, that we found this here. We could end it here, but history doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
You know?
It's too easy otherwise. It's too easy.
Indeed.
That's why we get paid the big bucks, right?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes. When it comes down to the actual, like, what happens, Preston is as good as you're going to get. Simplistically speaking, the way he describes it, the mob forms, small at first, tensions rise, and he loses control of the situation, and shots are fired. In the trial, transcripts and notes, they go into trying to figure out whether the opening, the discharge was relevant, whether was it warranted. But we don't really need to get into that particularly, because that's a matter of sort of 18th century law, more as shots were fired, things were thrown to make that happen. The soldiers were not the best disciplined, it would seem, that they did not know the voice of the commanding officer on parade. Amidst it must have been very loud down there, and everybody seemed to be. If you read through, we can put links, I guess, to the sources we're using, so people can read them themselves if they want.
Absolutely.
But you'll find that every single one of them uses the same language that Preston talks about: the bloody backs, the lobsters, damning them to hell,
Fire,
yeah.
All that,
Yeah, you dare not fire, things like that. Daring them to fire, because obviously that is illegal for the troops to fire without a magistrate's permission. But yet they do. So all Preston says there is borne out, pretty much, if you just read through them all. There's slightly different variations, but it's interesting that once they start to fire, you get some interesting things like, there are two people very close to Preston at the time, and as far as I can figure out from the depositions, that's a guy called Richard Palms and a guy called Mr. Bliss. The accounts of Palms and Bliss are some of the kind of they're the same. I feel they're the same kind of tone as Preston's, that they're trying to give a kind of a concise, I don't know what the word is, professional almost view of what happened, a level-headed one. But they're not from soldiers. These guys are townspeople, and they would appear to have, as things are escalating and things are getting seemingly dangerous in the street, they seem to be going up to Preston to try and talk to him about it. He describes people talking to him, and these two guys, Mr. Bliss and Mr. Palms, who are the next two things that we're going to read, they talk. They identify themselves essentially as those two people, as the people that they're talking to Preston, and they give an outline of a commensurate outline that goes alongside Preston's from obviously a different viewpoint, and I found them quite interesting to compare to Preston's, especially when looking at when things have gotten out of control.
I, Richard Palms, of Boston, of lawful age, testify and say that between the hours of 9 and 10 o'clock last Monday evening, the 5th instant, I heard one of the bells ring, which I thought was for fire. I went towards where I thought it was, and was told that the soldiers were abusing the inhabitants. I asked where the soldiers were, and was answered in King Street, and that there was a rumpus at the custom house door. As soon as I got there, I saw Captain Preston at the head of 6 or 8 soldiers. The soldiers had their guns breast high and with their bayonets fixed. I went immediately to Captain Preston and asked him if the soldiers' guns were loaded. His answer was, they were loaded with powder and ball. I then asked him if they intended that they should fire on the inhabitants. His answer to me was, by no means. I did not hear him tell the soldiers not to fire, nor did I hear him speak to them. I saw a piece of ice fall among the soldiers. Immediately upon this, the soldier upon his right hand fired his gun. That instant I heard the word fire, but by whom I know not. The soldier at his left hand fired next, and the others one after another as fast as they could. I turned myself to my left and saw one man dead, upon which I struck at the soldier who first fired the gun, and hit his left arm or hand, which made his gun fall. I then struck at Captain Preston and thought I hit his head, but he says I hit his arm. On my making the stroke at him, I fell on my right knee. I saw the soldier that fired the first fire going to push his bayonet at me, upon which I threw my stick at his head. He gave back and gave me an opportunity to jump out of his way, or must been run through the body. I directly passed through Exchange Lane, and so up the next by Mr. Kent's office, and saw 3 people on the ground, and saw Mr. Gridley, with several other persons, carrying Mr. Morton's apprentice up to the prison house. I followed him, and saw he had a ball shot through his breast. At my return, found the soldiers were gone to the main guard, etc. Signed, Richard Palms. And that is an account, in a way, very similar, yes, to the overall one that Captain Preston is giving, but also strangely variant in terms of what happens exactly when and how these different events are connected with each other. Curiously, he says, first, that a piece of ice fell among the soldiers. Whether it was thrown, whether it fell off the building, that's kind of... that seems kind of vague to me. It might just be the 18th century language saying, oh yes, it fell among the soldiers as in was thrown, but in any case, the ice lands, then they fire, and then he goes to strike. He thinks he gets Preston's head, he gets his arm, and then the strike against the soldier, which makes him drop the firelock, which then, it causes more violence and whatnot. Whereas I know that I've read accounts by which a soldier is knocked down or drops the firelock, and then he fires, which always seemed a bit more logical to me. That maybe it was just an accident. But this is now contradicting that one. And then it also refers rather interestingly to a soldier actually going in with his bayonet, which is even more forceful. That's not an automatic response so much. That is a purposeful attempt on the soldier to visit violence. And that is very much then going to be very significant overall, I dare say, as far as, at least as far as that soldier's particular trial is concerned.
Yeah. I mean, it. So you can sort of like you say, it corroborates broadly, but differs in detail. So Preston says that something was thrown amongst the soldiers and hit one of them. He said, I think it was ice or a snowball or something, I think Preston says. And that caused him to fire.
Mm-hmm. And Preston does also say that there were people who were struck, like physically with cudgels, before the firing, whereas here we have it very distinctively after the firing. And
there are definitely some witnesses who are trying to... it feels like they're trying to downplay the part of the mob.
Yeah.
Certainly, maybe and these people, I get the impression, aren't so much trying to cause trouble as to try and diffuse the situation almost.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. With this guy, he does identify that this soldier advanced on him with the intention of running him through, but that could be because he struck him first, of course.
Yeah.
And so violence was offered. I mean, in terms of the bayonets question, they had their bayonets charged breast high, and that's in the manual drill book of whichever it is, what year ever it is.
1764, manual exercise that you charge.
Yeah,
in a
it's up
very
here.
Something like that.
They use interesting phrases that shows a certain knowledge of military language, like to push his bayonet, and that is a direct order to push it forward as a stab.
Mm-hmm.
Preston talks about about people pressing in to the tips of the bayonets and even to the muzzles of the muskets, so they must move past them and things like that.
And striking at the muzzles and pushing them away and everything. So
yeah.
You can imagine just the physical closeness that all involves to be able to do those sorts of things.
And so it's very, you can see that there's jostling going on down there, and stuff is being thrown through the air, and there's people yelling in people's faces. If you think of, like, as you're saying, social problems at the second, that if you look at not even today, like recent ones, events, but if you look at previous events online or something, and you see when people go toe to toe with the authorities, they really get into their faces as close as they possibly can to.
And honestly, a lot of what I read here, as far as Palms running up and asking, "Will you fire? Will you have the soldiers fire?" You can imagine this isn't two men, a couple of feet apart, maintaining proper social distance and having a conversation like, "Will you inquire?" Sometimes I think the language, it can seem so proper and formal to us and everything from our modern perspective, but these are, I inquired after whether the gentleman, will you have the soldiers fire this evening? No, he's in the officer's face, and they're screaming, because you have to be shouting in order to be heard in this mess. This is a very, very high adrenaline kind of moment. He's not just asking, will you have the soldiers fire? I will not have the soldiers fire. That you can imagine again the violence, even intrinsic in the social interaction, let alone, the fact that everyone keeps on using that key word of fire. And in the manual arms, the manual exercise, that word is a very key word of you do this, you pull the trigger. Even from the reenactor's perspective, it's actually a very common thing that we do practicing at our events and practicing in our drill, that, we'll always, have the men go through the motions of loading and firing multiple times, like dry firing, pretending. They always, present and fire, click, make ready, present, fire, click, present, fire, click. And then all of a sudden, if it's a clever junior officer, clever NCO, make ready, present, recover. And everyone has to go like this. They have to recover their arms, which is coming back to this sort of position. And there's always one guy who you hear, click, ah ha ha ha, you were anticipating the command. And the same exact thing, I imagine that there have been multiple instances where, unfortunately for safety-wise, we do that for safety reasons, because sometimes you're too close and you can't shoot because we're not actually trying to shoot people. We're not trying to actually hurt people with the blast of the powder. So if you're too close, the command might be given, recover, in which case I go like that. But every once in a while, you might get a guy who still pulls that trigger because it's so automatic. And indeed, there might even be an instance in the chaos where one officer can shout, recover, and NCO notices, oh, those guys are a bit closer, maybe this is a bad idea. They shout fire, one guy shouts recover, one guy shouts fire, and the line can open up. And then you have this situation in which everyone is using that key word of fire in such close, tight corridors. And when these guys are already terrified, and again, with this long history of violence, this isn't a notable instance right away. This is just another day of the same old, as we've talked about before. They pull the trigger. It's not terribly surprising that they do.
No, I don't think so, especially since there seems to be very little sort of, there's not a good ratio of officers and NCOs to men here. I think there might be a corporal present. Somewhere else it says, not in this account, but somewhere else I think a corporal might be possibly there. And it's noted actually in Adams's notes of the trial. Why is a captain in charge of such a small detachment?
Yeah,
why is he out
exactly.
there?
Why is he here?
So that's interesting as well. I thought it was very interesting as well what you're talking about, the recovery, because, and I don't know if maybe Mr. Bliss talks about it later, but certainly other ones, that maybe it's the trial record again, where a lot of the same people talk. And I think this is actually sort of like transcripts of a lot of the trial evidence, which it was taken down in a kind of a messy, kind of a abbreviated hand. they talk of the fact that between the first shot and the succeeding 3 shots, there was a gap in which Preston, many people said, would have had the chance to say, recover.
Yeah, that window of seizing initiative, had he been aware of you might argue, oh, he was wounded or some such, but still his job as an officer is to take control in that situation. And all the sources really do seem to agree that there was that pause, that it wasn't all right off the bat, but there was the ragged volley after the initial shot. That
the soldiers are obviously not sure who's giving them the commands. They're obviously not sure of the situation. They're not sure what they should be doing. And it's interesting as well that Preston says that his action after the first shot is fired is to go up to the man and ask him why he fired. He doesn't give an order.
Yeah.
Essentially, he loses control of the situation, and very quickly thereafter, more shots are fired.
Yeah, so you can imagine while he turns around and he's talking to the one guy, all of a sudden down the line, all those men hearing the word fire, boom, 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 boom. It's definitely a misstep.
Yeah, and it's very interesting as well that he talks about, and very sympathetic as well, actually, about how the men would be hearing all these people saying versions of fire, fire, we dare you to fire, you dare not fire.
Yeah.
And
fire
anything he says almost could be heard by someone looking. He could open his mouth at the same time as someone else is saying something else. Yeah. And it's a very fascinating kind of dynamic to think about. Not only the fact that he is actually hurt, because Mr. Palms admits to actually trying to brain him.
Yeah, very true. He's like, I thought I got him in the head, but it turns out it was only the arm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and he says, and he actually says that Preston told him, no, you didn't get me in the head, you got me in the arm. And Preston says in his account that if he got me in the head, this guy who tried to hit me, I'd have probably been knocked unconscious.
Yeah.
But his arm is stunned, actually. He says he can't use it.
And so you can imagine as well, that he's just been attacked and everything during the cast. It's understandable that he isn't, at the top of his game here to be able, and so he turns around, inquiring to the individual soldier. And as well, actually, there is an element as far as, when one soldier fires, that doesn't suddenly mean that the situation is diffused. The mob doesn't run away after that. They're still there. Either, they fall dead quiet, but if they did, I imagine we would hear about that a lot more regularly. A moment's silence broke out. Or they, they surge. They probably get, they're going to get more and more inflamed by that. And so the idea of perhaps, rather than shouting recover means you're bringing it back up. All of a sudden, like, oh, delightful, you've just opened up that space. They have immediately closed in. That thin line of bayonets is the only thing right now separating you from them. And as we mentioned earlier, they're still beginning to filter in through that to the muzzle of the guns and everything. It's not a very strong barrier. So maybe even if it either, he lost control of the situation and he was incapable of giving the command, or maybe even that was a purposeful, like, I can't do that, not right now. This is not a decided event. And like, obviously the one firing was a mistake, so he's asking, why did you do that? But unfortunately, that one firing may mean that more are necessary. Obviously, he didn't give the command to fire the second time. It doesn't seem like many of the accounts say that. But, that's probably a possibility in the mind at that sort of point, at least one of many possibilities.
Not long after Richard Palms, we have number 114. And that is also interesting, and it reads, Sir, at your request, I now sit down to give you the particulars of Monday evening, the 5th instant. I shall endeavour to divest myself of prejudice and relate the unhappy affair with the utmost impartiality. I have already given in to several juries of inquest 2 depositions, not altogether alike in words, but the same in substance, and this is similar to them both, and is as follows. I, being in King Street that evening, between the hours of 9 and 10 o'clock, saw a sentry that was placed at the customs house loading his musket, and swore to a number of persons that were passing from Royal Exchange Lane to Quaker House. If they molest him, he would fire among them, which occasioned numbers to gather round him, some of whom huzzayed and told him to fire and be damned. Immediately on this, I saw Captain Preston with a number of soldiers coming from the guardhouse to the customs house with their bayonets charged, who soon formed into half a circle and began without any provocation to push their bayonets at the people, one of which went through my coat, for which Captain Preston reprimanded him, and then told Captain Preston it would be prudent for him to retire and take his men with him, for in case they molested the people, I feared the consequences would be bad. He replied he would do the best he could, or words to that effect. At this time I heard a person ask Captain Preston whether they were loaded. He replied they were. He then asked whether he intended they should fire. He answered, by no means. Also, I saw some of the soldiers to appearance load their muskets, which induced me to say to Captain Preston, for God's sake, don't let your men fire. He replied, they shall not. At this instant, I saw a cake of ice or snowball strike a grenadier upon the right of the detachment, upon which he levelled his piece and fired. Captain Preston left me directly. I heard the word fire several times, which I supposed was uttered by the soldiers, upon which all, or most of them, fired and loaded. I then retired down Royal Exchange Lane and returned in about 3 or 4 minutes. I saw the body of a person called Michael Johnson lying on the ground, which I supposed to be in consequence of their firing. I now told Captain Preston the fatal effects of their firing and begged he would retire as his life was in danger, on which he said, sentries, leave your posts and retire to the main guard, which they immediately did.
So immediately again, we get a number of little detail, like overall, yes, the same narrative, and particularly the words "they shall not" in response to whether they intend to fire. All that is very consistent, but it kind of throws us through a loop once again, because while all those details are very consistent, we're like, oh, okay, so this all seems pretty good. But then he says that not only do the soldiers have their bayonets leveled, but they're actually thrusting forward with them actively. So not just to the one guy after the firing, because that's what our earlier account by Mr. Palm said is, after all the firing, when I was on the ground after having struck the officer, he thrusts at me, but rather before all of that, they are poking and prodding, attempting to keep people away from them. Which definitely makes sense in a way, because, if you do just have it leveled with only, 8 or 9 guys, or however many it was, there's a large gap, so you can very easily filter through, whereas if they're actively, poking away, that makes sense in a way, but we don't see it mentioned in many other accounts, most notably, of course, not in Preston's account. It says he pierced a man's coat, and then how Captain turns and, not only does he, this is before he censures the man for firing, he censures a soldier for being a bit too eager with the thrusting, which, you'd think that's kind of a big deal. Those are words actively spoken, and this is now the first that we're hearing of those words, which again adds just basically a level of fog over the whole thing. Are we trusting this man in particular? But then, so if we are trusting this man in particular, does that then mean that we distrust the other accounts which are neglecting to mention this? If the other accounts are neglecting to mention this, why are they neglecting it to mention it? If this man is making it up, why is he imagining that it happened? Etc., etc., etc.
Indeed. This is where I would very much advise everybody to if you want to look at what happened, because this is just a taster of what you can discuss and how you can build a picture of what goes on, and personal narratives and things like that, how that applies to a grander narrative. But if you get this far as reading the appendixes of these 2 works that we're using today, and indeed looking at the account of Captain Preston, which is actually on the Massachusetts Historical Society's website, then also there'll be a link to the legal papers of John Adams, in which is contained from October to December 1770. So actually the trial happens way later, when things have died down,
Mm.
of these soldiers. And you'll see very interesting little bits about people, lawyers essentially, disseminating what they're hearing and trying to make some sort of sense out of it. And it's interesting because they dismiss certain accounts as being just absurd and just utter fabrications for political gain, and they put others ahead for reasons of corroboration and basic, I don't know, legitimacy, or just that dragons did not fly through the air and things like that. So I really encourage people to have a look at them because they're fascinating.
I mean, in particular, even just looking at the same page, numbers 115 and 116 are from a lieutenant in the 14th and an ensign in the 14th. So two junior officers and what they have to say. The lieutenant's going on about how apparently the mob is shouting, "Down with him! Kill him! Kill him!" That's a whole other
layer.
There's
and again,
threats.
and that's that's number 115. We've spent 2 hours or thereabouts going over 4 or 5, a very small selection of these. The amount of detail that you can pull from these accounts and what it can inform you about the time period, about the particular event, but really, again, the broader events and everything that's transpiring. There's so much value in going through not merely other historians' interpretations of these events, and even worse, individual reenactors or individual documentaries and whatnot, their interpretation, but actually looking at the original stuff. Because again, like we said, it's so easy to just pick out, oh, okay, well, what we could have done today is we'll look at Preston's, and then we'll look at, and then we'll look at Palm's account, and we'll compare the two, and oh, well, clearly this is a pretty straightforward event, as a lot of people tend to do. There's so much depth. And you can imagine this is only one very minor event in the overall occupation of Boston.
Absolutely, because this doesn't even end it. That night, as Preston says himself, 2 regiments are mobilized from their barracks. Well, one actually goes into the streets, and the other one just stands to arms.
Yeah.
And officers, as you were saying earlier, aren't in the same barracks area as the men. They live in separate houses and things. So as you go on into this section here, I think that's Napier and Hallwood, and in the succeeding pages you have Mattier and things like, these are all the officers I was telling you about before we started. This knot of officers of the 14th Foot, they come running out into the streets because they hear the drums sounding the alarm, and their servants have alerted them to this problem that's happened. The shots being fired and the alarm bells and things like that. And they come into the street, and they just go running to where they're supposed to meet their companies and things, and to form up with the colours. And basically they get accosted by citizens, by Bostonians, by some of the mob who have dispersed from King Street or have come out to, because obviously Preston lays it out pretty neatly, to be honest, at the end, where he talks about how these troops are mobilized because there's masses of people coming into the streets in outrage. And these poor officers pretty much come out and they get accosted. One of them at least gets knocked down, and all the other ones have to come to his rescue. There's a surgeon who gets accosted as well on his way to stand to, and pretty much he's asked to show his clothes because he's wearing an overcoat, and they want to see if he's wearing a red coat. And luckily he wasn't, because he was of the opinion that he would have been pretty badly beaten, if not killed, if he had been wearing one. That's the rest of the night, is an alarm, essentially, and running fights through the streets where, God help you if you happen to be an unaccompanied soldier. And the lieutenant governor, as Preston said, finally arrives, by which time he's somehow able to tell everybody basically to go home. That being said, I think I mentioned earlier, maybe I didn't, that one of the first things he says when he gets there, actually, upon hearing that soldiers have shot into a crowd, who's the officer in charge, and why did he shoot without a magistrate's permission? And that is a big part of the trial that follows. And the upshot, of course, of that particular night is the next day that the lieutenant governor convenes a council, and there's toing and froing between the governing council, which is essentially representing the British authorities, and the town of Boston, the citizens of Boston, who convene at Faneuil. How do you say it? Faneuil Hall?
Faneuil Hall, at least as the modern Bostonian.
Wow.
Okay, Faneuil Hall, where apparently up to 3,000 people have met to vote on whether the soldiers should leave or go, headed by everybody's patriot friend Samuel Adams, I believe, and he basically they do force the lieutenant governor to advise the colonels of the 14th and 29th regiments to remove their troops to a place called Castle William or something like that. And so that's just, I mean, like you say, we've only done like 4 or 5 accounts, and it's taken this long already. And that's just like a glimpse of how deep you can go into these sort of subjects when you have the rich amount of sources. When not every subject is that lucky, actually, as the Boston Massacre, to have this many people talk about one incident. But that brings us to the end of what we can humanly do. At the second, I think we would both love to do more on the subject, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what we can humanly do in this recording about the Boston Massacre, a pivotal moment in the lead up to the American Revolution. Certainly the Patriots would like people to believe so anyway. Yes. And I hope that everybody watching enjoyed it. If you have any comments or anything like that about or can enlighten us as to further things that we didn't mention or things that we should be aware of, do please put them in the comments section below. Thank you for watching. Please do whatever it takes for you to continue in life, having watched this video and enjoyed it with guilt-free, by which I mean like and subscribe. Yes. And hopefully, and I'll see you soon for another adventure in Historyland, with thanks to Brandon F. for his excellent commentary on the sources here, and for a really, really, really great conversation about them.
Thank you very much. This has been, again, infinitely longer than both of us intended, but I think with good cause. This has been a lot of fun, and I look forward to doing it again. Perhaps another day for the Boston Tea Party, considering that we've used up all of our time pretty much, but we will get there. We will get there. Yes, and then of course, for my side of things, to all of you, my dear viewers, thank you so very much for tagging along with both of us today. And of course, until the next time, we both are, I'm sure. Sorry, I'm looking at you over here, but you're over there technically. I'm sure that both of us are your most humble and obedient of servants.